Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast where we explore the bold ideas, uncomfortable truths, and unexpected solutions shaping the future of responsible business. Today, we're learning how to reboot the sustainability script in a world where the word itself is increasingly politicized. Our article this week is It's Time to Update How Your Company Talks About Sustainability by Kim Grob and Vivian Lee, a practical guide for brands navigating the turbulent communications landscape of 2025. And I'm delighted to say our guests today are Rob Agnew and Cat Biggart, both SVPs at Clarity Global, with decades of combined experience steering fast growth companies through high stakes narratives. Guys, it's absolutely brilliant to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for giving up your time. Cat, I'm going to come to you first, if possible. I've obviously very briefly and sort of tantalized a little about your role and a little bit about Clarity Global. Would you mind just giving our listeners and viewers a bit more meat on the bone?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Charlie. It's lovely to be here. So as you said, I'm a senior vice president based in London at Clarity. So we are a full service integrated marcoms agency. We're based in Shoreditch. We've been going for about 14 years now. And my role really, I'm the UK lead for what we call our responsible business unit. So that was set up late last year to help all of our clients really navigate the complexities of sustainability communications, if you like, in what is an increasingly difficult, unstable, challenging global context. So I work with clients from all walks of life. We are primarily a tech agency, but yeah, across sort of fintech, AI, enterprise, SaaS, you name it.
Fantastic, Cat. That was a brilliant nutshell. I should say, for any of our listeners and viewers that want to check out either Cat or Rob's LinkedIn profiles, we'll be providing appropriate links for people to go and have a bit of a nosy, if you like. But Cat, I'm picking up on a bit of an accent here. Now, I'm terrible with accents, and before I offend you by calling you something that you're not, perhaps we can go back to a little bit more of the origin story and learn a little bit more about how you've ended up in this position and ultimately, what's driven you to do what you've done in your career to date.
Yes. So you are right. I have got an accent. I like to think it's quite subtle, but I am from Australia. I grew up in Sydney, but moved to the UK about 25 years ago. I mean, it's so long now. I've lived longer in the UK than I ever did in Australia, which is horrifying to me. Shows how old I am. But I have always been sort of fascinated by the natural world, and I think that origin story, if you like, it goes back to when I was probably at primary school. I was definitely a schoolgirl, maybe 8-9 years old, and I was living in a sort of fairly rural suburb outside of Sydney. It wasn't until I went to secondary school that we moved up much closer to the city, and I would spend my time after school like climbing trees, and we had this rope swing over a river down the road. So I'd go down with my friends and, we'd get on our bikes and we'd go wherever the mood took us. It was a very sort of freeing childhood. But it was always sort of spending time in nature with my friends. And I cared deeply about the little creatures that I came across, whether that was rescuing bees from our swimming pool. I had a real I'd do this every day after school. I'd come home and see if any bees were going to drown. Or, picking up sort of little blue, like discarded birds' eggs from nests in the bush that was just down the road. So yeah, from a very young age, I have this memory of feeling very connected to nature. And I think I had that sort of understanding of how important that was, even as a very young child. So by the time I came to secondary school, I had decided I wanted to be a vet, or zoologist, or some other sort of natural scientist, thing as a career. And I ended up doing a lot of science at secondary school. But ultimately, I did not get the very, very high marks I needed, being super competitive. I'm sure it's the same in the UK, but to do vet science in Australia, you need higher marks than to do medicine. So you've, more intelligent to look after animals than humans. But anyway, that's a different conversation. But I ended up going into sort of natural science, and then I changed to psychology because I did a psychology, one of my course subjects was psychology, and I found it absolutely fascinating. And that basically led me to marketing and communications. So I then did, when I graduated, a very unenvironmental thing, and I flew all the way to London to go traveling around Europe with my best friend, and I'm still based here. But my sort of work in communications has led me to, realizing that I've got a lot of influence in terms of what we tell people about companies and what they're doing, the good they're doing, etc. And whether that's sort of to stakeholders like investors or influencing customers or supply chain, etc. So the more I sort of looked into that world, I realized that that's where I wanted to specialize within this role of communications. And that really is what led me to my role here at Clarity.
And Kat, that was brilliantly summarized. And I almost think that your year abroad has escalated somewhat, hasn't it, to the 25 years down the road? I mean, you must have found yourself by now on this gap year. This has really been an extended period. But taking you back to sort of, if you can, the mentality of younger self thinking about and identifying through your experience of sciences that actually psychology was an area that you were particularly interested in, and then the opportunity within a marketing comms kind of career of applying that. How much of the awareness did you have at that time of the potential impact and influence of that type of career on realizing some of the kind of environmental, wildlife, nature-based kind of concerns, if you like, that you had as a younger person? How much of that was clear to you then, or was it something that sort of evolved and developed over the course of your career?
Yeah, I would say it wasn't clear at all, actually. And it's almost like it's come full circle, because when I first went into communications, I was specializing in tech, more specifically in telecoms. And at the time, we're going back probably 18 years or something since I had my first comms role. The telecom sector was not one that was sort of high on the ESG awareness or sort of doing good in the world. It was very much about, pushing the, I'll tell you a funny story. And that was that I was working with O2, who at the time had the sort of exclusive rights to launch the iPhone. So, no one else in the UK could launch it. There had not been a touch screen. There were no apps. This was a game-changing moment for telecoms. And it was sort of growth at all costs at that point, regardless of digging up all the lithium for the batteries. I just didn't have any awareness, I don't think, of what was necessarily at stake at that point. And it was a very exciting moment. So I got caught up in the kind of zeitgeist of it all. And it was, it was fascinating, but it wasn't really until I got to Clarity, actually. And we started working with a few clients who were doing good things in the sort of green tech, clean tech space. And that got me thinking, well, actually, I think this is something that I want to do as a focus. I'm going to move away from telecoms, and I'm actually going to make this my career path. And I've not looked back since.
And can I ask you, because it's aligned with my own experience to a certain extent, and this might be a leading question, and therefore feel free to give me a strong forward defensive. You did mention cricket the first time during our preamble, so I'm going to bring up all the cricket analogies now. I'm a keen cricketer myself, but so I spent 10 years kind of working in an agency that was sort of focused on, working with clients in the built environment sector, and it was growth at all costs, as you described, and selling as much insulation and as many widgets and all the rest of it as you possibly could. For me, there was almost that 10-year point of going like, all right, what am I doing here? Like, what am I actually, what's the impact of what I'm doing? And I've sold a bit more stuff for people, but have I done anything really particularly positive? And for me, finding, the work that we're doing at the Charter and TrueMark, et cetera, it's been, from a personal perspective, just such an amazing sort of transformation in terms of how I feel about my work. Just touch on that. Like, what's it been like for you personally now, looking to lead the responsible business unit as you've described, and working on, good corporate practice?
Yeah. So, well, there's a couple of things to say about that. Well, firstly, I think the sense of purpose in my job has become much, much greater. I think it probably changed when I had children. Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of people would probably say that, but it made me much more aware of, what am I really doing to make the world a better place for them? I loved my job. I found it interesting. I got to meet fascinating people. I worked with some incredible brands, but I don't think I really felt that it was 100% aligned with what I felt, sort of the emotional connection. So I think the other thing I was going to say is that I met a very inspirational woman called Julia, who heads the whole responsible business unit. I think she's actually been on your podcast before, Charlie, so you might remember her. But I work very closely with her. She's based in Australia, and she's the sort of lead of the unit, and I look after the UK bit. But she alone has sort of taught me so much about the potential for the power of communications in this sector, and I think it's just made me love my job so much more because it's aligned to those values, and I think that's just so crucial.
Rob, again, very briefly introduced your SVP role at Clarity Global. Please do give us a little bit more, a bit more insight.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work in the sort of ethereal unit of strategy, whatever that means, and perhaps there's a bit of communications work to do around that word as well, actually. But at Clarity, I head the strategy and planning unit, which is named the Clarity Intelligence Unit, and it's basically my job to draw the line between business challenge and marketing and communications capability. So we have a sort of larger mandate within Clarity than perhaps other agencies because we actually have the full suite of services, and it's about bringing those together in a really sort of lean and integrated fashion to actually deliver on business outcomes, of which I work very closely with Cat when those outcomes are around responsibility, sustainability, and wider ESG issues. So yeah, that's my role, and I sort of very much enjoy my time at Clarity because my benefit is propelled by the brilliance and the intelligence of the people around me rather than me doing anything in particular. So it's been a really interesting journey with them so far.
Love that, Rob. One of the things that I particularly enjoyed about our pre-show meeting was your self-deprecation, which is going to come up again, I'm sure. Let me ask you, you mentioned there about the work that you do with Kat and her team when it comes to the ESG responsible business. Out of interest, like how many briefs now, percentage wise, are factoring in that kind of responsible ESG related sort of consideration?
I think that the answer to that is all of them. It's whether the briefs pick that out directly or not. So I think that's another thing at a point of discussion for today, is that this is the thinking around responsible business, the thinking around sustainability within communications is baked into corporate thinking, particularly in the UK, and I've spent the last 4 years in the US where it is less so, but particularly in the UK, wider Europe and Australia, it is baked in, but there is a fear about calling that out directly, as we sort of highlighted within our recent report, and also within the article that we're here to discuss. So that's why Kat and I work together so closely, and Kat is a part of that intelligence unit framework, because we have to have that layer of expertise built into every brief, regardless of whether the desired business outcome is truly sort of capitalist in its nature. It doesn't matter. You have to have a responsible business component baked into every objective.
And that's fascinating to hear. We'll come on to ask a little bit more about your sort of background pre-Clarity, but fascinating to hear that there is that clear distinction between your experience in the US and your experience of working in the UK and Europe, that actually there is more of a sort of a baked in need to consider the responsible business sort of side of things when considering briefs. Let me ask you though, Rob, let's, as we've done with Kat and gone back to Australia, with you, I think we're a little closer to home here in the UK, but I might be surprised. Perhaps just give us a little bit more flavor as to your formative experiences and what have driven you to do what you've done. so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Vastly less exciting than Cat. I come from sort of South Northamptonshire, North Buckinghamshire border, but also rural. So the way that Cat described her childhood is very familiar to me. One of freedom and flying off rope swings and doing things that I still haven't told my mother to this day. So we'll continue to maintain that.
It's
that
a
guys.
safe place, Rob. Feel free to share. Sure.
Absolutely, but a very different one in the nature of the community that I grew up in, actually, and that sort of forges my origin story in a way. So, surrounded by the farming community, and I think at a very early age I was very, very aware of the impact that the push and the righteous push around environmental protection was actually having at a household and a business level, particularly on a community that suffer various hardships just by the very nature of their work and the lack of predictability you have around something like the weather. I spent a lot of my childhood running large cafetières of coffee and tin-foiled wraps of sandwiches up to combines, as that was the only useful bit that you could do at the grand old age of, say, 8 or 10. But you realise just how hard working this community were and the pressures that they faced. And like a lot of what we will discuss today, the impact of regulation, legislation, societal perspective forged in metropolitan societies has increasingly outsized impact on rural communities, and particularly those working within them. So my view was forged slightly from I guess in a way a more contrarian perspective around these issues. Totally, upon moving into London and really, at the time in my career, the ESG boom, I suppose, in many ways was happening. I always laugh that I've spent the first years of my career talking nothing other than the upside of ESG, and now I spend the latter years of my career doing, quite frankly, the risk around the risk and mitigation around talking about it, which shows how far we've come in just over a decade. But ultimately, understanding the benefit of it, but also recognizing that there are a marginalized community here, communities with little voice in the argument, who were facing most of the impact. And I think that's where my sort of desire to work in communications came from, was that we are now in an age, particularly with technology, with the kind of distributed communications infrastructure that we have, that it's actually more about the story and how compelling it is rather than the size of the audience. And you see that to an extent with, Clarkson's Farm being a huge hit on Amazon Prime, and just how many people are willing to spend their precious leisure hours watching a man go up and down a field in a combine harvester, and him talking about just how tough this lifestyle is and what they have to contend with from Westminster often. So that's always been it's been a really interesting evolution of my career, and certainly driven me to believe in the power of communications. And I really don't think it's been realized, but I think there are a number of steps that I've seen in recent years that make this really compelling. And that takes me to Texas as well, where I spent the last 4 years, and that really, it really backed up my perspective on a lot of the things that I'd felt from a very young age. If you want to look at the societal impact that business and environmentalism can have on a household and a business level, then there is just no better place to be than the great state of Texas. And I think we have an awful lot to learn about the societal aspect, the S in ESG, from a state like Texas, and it really, really drew upon that idea that the marginalized in society still do not have a voice in this argument, and they really, really should have one, because they have some really compelling stories to tell about how all of this is shaping up.
Out of interest, what lessons learned from a state like Texas when it comes to the S? Do they do a better job, are you saying, of drawing upon and understanding and raising up the experience of the marginalized in their society, or is that something that they're struggling with as well? I've just clarified that for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's not necessarily that they do a better job or a worse job. It's just about the social contract that is drawn up in a state like Texas is just very different. So the priority is always around or predominantly around the economics and maintaining household benefit and making sure that people have what they need in order to enact the freedoms that they desire to have. And obviously that can sometimes fly in the face of the E in ESG. As you know, it was a large petro state, and still a large portion of the state income is driven from that part of industry. But their ability to recognize how legislation and how things that are decided within the city of Austin would have an impact across the economic viability of households and businesses across the state is second to none. So it's not that they have indeed a better approach or indeed a worse approach. It was just a very, very different mandate from the policymakers that were making big decisions that could impact the financial health of households and businesses. And that was at the forefront of every decision that they made.
And that's presumably from how you described your experience of growing up in the farming community here in the UK. That's the stark difference, that the implications of the policy on the lived experience of, for example, the farming community they're very well aware of it, very well observant of it and the potential impact before that policy is implemented. Is that the key lesson, if you like, that you've then taken from your experience in the US and perhaps brought back to some of the sort of the work that you're doing with clients here in the UK and Europe?
Exactly right. And I think the future is really bright if we can bleed it together. The clear justification for ensuring that we invest long term in green technologies and clean apparatus, and recognizing that you need to put the household and the business at the forefront of that. You need to put people's lives at the forefront of that change. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of mistakes. There is very few people who do not want to see cleaner air, cleaner water, more sustainable business practices. But those things come at a cost, and I think we need to recognize that cost shouldn't be that shouldn't be a burden that is placed on some of the parts of society that are least resilient in order to take the impact of that on. So I think it's a really interesting case study that you see this transition occur in a state like Texas, where that state is now making enormous volumes of money off green energy rather than petrochemicals, but all of the infrastructure that was built there to support that transition, all the roads, all of the bridges, all of the fiber optic cable, a lot of the wind energy is there purely because because the oil and gas companies built it. So we have to recognize that infrastructure now needs to be leveraged into a green agenda, but we should also recognize that it only exists as a result of previous mandates and households and businesses that sacrificed in order to make that happen.
Rob, you're going to get your first here of the show. I give them out to guests that I think nail particular points. I'm going to summarize what you've just described in a very sort of oversimplistic way of pragmatic, joined up thinking that ultimately creates an opportunity to bring people along the journey, if you like, of transition by being really sympathetic and understanding of how policy, et cetera, is going to affect their lived experience. And if you can get that right, you get people bought into ultimately what you're trying to achieve. I know we're talking from a policy perspective, but I think that can be applied from a from a corporate point of view as well. Guys, as you'll see, we've absolutely obliterated our time as introducing you both, but I've enjoyed it. I'm sure our guests, our listeners have enjoyed it too. Kat, I'm going to come to you now if possible. Would you mind providing us with a bit of if you won't mind actually stating the title again of the article for this week, and then perhaps just picking out from the article, just giving us a bit of a summary and introduction to it.
Yeah, sure. So the title is "It's Time to Update How Your Company Talks About Sustainability." This was a piece on HBR, Harvard Business Review, and it really talks about the need to change how brands are communicating to overcome or navigate the challenges when communicating sustainability. When there's a lot of political pushback, when if you say something, you might be accused of greenwashing. If you don't say something, you're accused of green hushing, and how you face those challenges. And I think the article really it gives a few quite specific sort of strategies, if you like. I think there are 3. It talks about understanding and addressing stakeholder expectations. It talks about connecting emotionally with audiences using stories and facts. So going into sort of human language, and then moving beyond the traditional sustainability report. So making sure that what you're reporting is actually year round. It's not just an annual tick box exercise. And overall, I think, the piece tries to provide that strategic direction and tactical advice. And I like that on the whole, it's encouraging brands to be braver, more creative, and relentlessly kind of audience focused. It talks about the language of sustainability a lot. And quite rightly, I think, points out the dangers of going quiet just because the political environment is so fraught. And there are some synergies actually within the article with our own learnings from a data report that we've just launched. So I've talked about this before, but we launched a report called The Responsible Business Outlook for Communicators. And it was based on a piece of research. So we surveyed 1,000 C-suite execs and sustainability leaders across the UK, US, Australia, and Amsterdam to get a sort of a global snapshot. And the story that data tells is really interesting. It's not of retreat, but more about sort of resilience and maturity. And we found that across the globe, in each market we surveyed, I believe, that businesses are not backing away from those commitments. They're actually getting smarter and more ambitious and more strategic about how they communicate, that progress and that impact. So, headlines at the moment obviously are focusing on companies that are stepping away from sustainability. But what our report shows is that it's a quieter sort of journey of progress. And yes, there might be a bit of sort of ESG rhetoric, especially in the US, but I think, those brands are actually showing that they don't necessarily want to follow that. I mean, there have been some sort of big headlines of late, particularly in the financial services industry, of people stepping back from those ESG commitments. But it's headlines. As I say, what our data is showing is that it's a slightly different story.
Which is incredibly encouraging, Kat, and great to hear that, and again, it kind of aligns with other, insights that we've gleaned from other areas as well, which is fantastic. Out of interest, you mentioned those kind of 3 strategies, if you like, that the article alludes to, essentially, that every organization should consider with their sustainability comms. How could we almost go through each, and perhaps you could pick out, what, if any, of your report and your insights back up or don't back up? Perhaps there's anything that is in this that actually, perhaps your report suggests another way of viewing things. Would you just touch on the sort of alignment between the 2?
Yeah. So I think, so there's this sort of theme of, the shift from sort of risk to opportunity, if you like. And the article, I think, makes quite a compelling case that, the value of sustainability goes beyond risk management. So talks about, citing business benefits, sort of reframes sustainability as a driver of innovation and efficiency and competitive advantage. And our report had found that in the UK, the biggest challenges are actually sort of budget constraints and stakeholder fatigue, that the communicators should focus on really clear, practical messaging. So it is about tying sustainability to outcomes like cost savings. And, it's not about talking about, instead of saying things like, the amount of CO2 saved, you're actually talking about ROI. So, if you want investors to get on board, they need to see the hard figures and what value can be brought from, a business through ESG. So I think that sort of does chime with what we have found. In terms of kind of connecting emotionally with your audience, so going beyond facts to support your messages, I agree with that. I know, Rob, you were going to say something about that sort of emotional language, weren't you? So I don't want to cannibalize what you were going to say.
That word emotional, I think, is nuanced. And I think what we've seen in the report, which also chimes with the article, is this idea of the conversation maturing. It's become apparent that this is much more complex than perhaps we had given the conversation credit 5-10 years ago, talking about the social impacts, and what actually this means for households, businesses, etc., means that we do need to mature the conversation. And I think to a large part, the emotional connectivity piece has landed us in this situation to an extent, right? I think the word that you used, Charlie, that I think really rings true, and I would switch it out with the word emotive, is pragmatic. I think when a conversation matures, you need to move away from aspirational, motivational, emotional conversation and communications and start to dive down into the practicalities of what this means for people in their day-to-day lives. And I think our business has a massive opportunity here. Cat and I work very closely with our public affairs team, for example. Much more difficult conversation at the policymaker level. Much more so. You have to obviously account for an increasingly polarized perspective on this argument, and you have to maintain some engagement with either one of those polarized views, depending on where your political affiliations sit. Businesses don't, to the same extent, right? And so, our advice to businesses now is to actually look at those win-win-win situations of sustainability, of which there are many, and be pragmatic about how you communicate them. Don't wrap them up in too much brand value and emotive language. Simply tell your audience that you have, let's, for example, talk about the circular economy movement. You have reduced cost. You have made your supply chain more resilient. And guess what? There is some environmental benefit tied in there as well. Now, nobody can argue around that communication, because you have done something practical, you've been pragmatic in the way you've displayed it, and the outcome is beneficial for every stakeholder within that universe. And you would be shocked how communicators and clients get themselves wrapped up in knots around how to talk about these things, when the downside almost, in many cases, just simply doesn't exist. So I think we have to be careful with that word emotive, and I think our industry has espoused that idea across everything, including ESG and purpose, for a very long time. And I think that's right when you need to motivate people around the idea and put it front of mind. But there is no doubt that this conversation is front of mind now. I mean, the political oxygen it takes up, the amount that corporates feel compelled to provide touch points around it, like this is front of mind. So there's no need to be emotive. It's now to actually get down to the hard work of making this happen.
Well, Rob, let me. I'm only going to play. I think it was brilliantly presented, and I'm probably going to regret playing a devil's advocate question back at you on this, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. When one of the things that's come up in a few conversations I've had is around kind of the collective apathy, perhaps, that's developed in terms of the way that some of these, and I'm going to use broad generalizations myself just to keep things easy, but the way that the ESG comms space kind of works. And obviously we've gone through this period of, brands virtue signaling and purpose washing in various different forms and aligning themselves with everything. and that's built this sort of sense of general distrust and ultimately apathy. How do we package up what you've just described, which seems very reasonable, that let's get pragmatic and clear and really focused on, what we as brands are ultimately doing and the impact that it's having, and yet still account for perhaps that kind of general apathy that people, stakeholders have towards these subjects? How do we reconcile those two?
We borrow the tactics that the other side have used to create that apathy. Fight fire with fire. On this, attack is very much the best form of defense on this. The problem with language and the way that humans operate is that we're very good at delivering very, very emotive, pithy communications when we're up on the rise and we're attacking. What we do is we wrap ourselves in knots when we try to defend our argument. Right, so we've got to start talking to as I said, the win-win-wins of this agenda. And when we are faced with the argument, instead of sort of backing ourselves into a corner and trying to unpick the argument that has been presented by the other side, we simply have to demonstrate the alternative universe that we're trying to deliver against here. So that means rooting a lot of our language in cost benefit and the more practical side of ESG and sustainability communications. One of the things that I find most interesting, and one industry that I think we absolutely have to watch, is the insurance industry here. It doesn't get more pragmatic or practical than that. You have a universe of risk experts who can tell you unequivocally that major weather-related events have increased dramatically over the last few years, and the cost of that to society is absolutely enormous. So rather than wrapping up that argument in politicized language, which we all have to accept has happened, and to a certain extent the greenwashing has created that environment, it has provided the alternative perspective on this argument to have a huge number of attack points, because the authenticity and the justification for a lot of those communications just fell foul of authentic. But we need to now root ourselves in the practicality and the reality of the situation now, which is that there are going to be a huge number of people, households and businesses that simply will not be able to operate in large Western economies because they will not be able to insure their property. That's a pretty drastic outcome, and one that really plays into the way that households and businesses feel at the moment. The macro picture here is really, really tough. So we need to start talking about what the upside is from a cost and a resilience perspective to people, and make sure that we demonstrate the empathy with their day-to-day reality. Because frankly, the overarching macro green agenda is not front of mind for a business person whose company is about to collapse, or the head of a household where they can't pay their bills. And actually it flies in the face a lot when you're talking as a politician or a business about a green agenda, and the strive for net zero in a country where the household energy bills have gone up through the roof, and you can't provide for your family as you wish. So that's, I guess, my overarching point is we can borrow the communication strategies of the other side, and we should be reflecting that in our communications.
And Rob, what you've just described there, I think perfectly aligns with that first sort of strategic suggestion that was in the article around, really understanding and appreciating the perspectives, the motivations of our stakeholders in a nuanced, specific, granular way, and understanding what therefore are the messages that are going to chime with that group, and really focusing on it. Cat, I wanted to pick up on, Rob has beautifully presented sort of the shift in focus that we need when it comes to sustainability comms, and almost provided us with a sort of a blueprint and a strategic guide. So thank you, Rob. Add it to the bill, my friend. But Cat, coming to you.
Yeah.
What can we talk a little bit about the carrots here for those brands and businesses that are going to get this right? The article alludes to the fact that essentially the age of green hushing, which again, really pleased to hear that your report is suggesting that this isn't such a prevalent issue. But I still think it has been perhaps over the course of the last couple of years. The implications that are missed opportunities. What are those missed opportunities for brands that aren't on the front foot when it comes to the sustainability comms?
I think the missed opportunity, this idea that silence is not neutrality, it's a missed opportunity basically to build up that trust with stakeholders. And I think we haven't really talked about it to a great extent yet, but it's about that sort of transparency and authenticity. And Rob, you touched on that. But I think for a brand to know that it doesn't all have to be good news, it's about owning the bad news and then showing the fix. So, I don't know if you followed at the time, but I think it was last year, Unilever scaled back some of its ESG commitments due to financial pressures, basically, and sort of operational challenges. But it communicated really well about that. It was a great case study for that. And, while reducing those targets is disappointing and, stakeholders ultimately, they want to see results and positive impact. But when companies clearly articulate the rationale for why they've changed those targets and what they're going to do about it next, I think it increases stakeholder trust hugely. And obviously it buys them a lot of goodwill. And as long as they then go ahead and try and make that fix, that they've got a lot of sort of brand value just out of that. The flip side, obviously, is what we're talking about, is that it can be seen as a huge negative. And if they're green hushing, so they're afraid to say what they're doing for fear of reprisal of that, that's worse, right? So, it's a tricky balance.
It's fascinating to hear this. He says, well, we have a section which is mandated at the start of every green claims policy that a signatory of the Anti-Greenwash Charter produces, which is literally titled Where We Can Improve. And the whole idea that we had here was, if that is the first section of your green claims policy, so I'm not even getting to the claims that I have evidence for and which third parties I'm used to verify them. Before I even get to that, I'm just going to acknowledge the areas where we as a business are not sustainable and where we are ultimately trying to get better. We use the phrase, the disarming nature of that. It's the disarming and liberating nature of that, because it gives you the opportunity then to speak really confidently about the things that you are doing and the impact that you're having. Perhaps just touch on that for me, Rob, in terms of like the impact of proactive disclosure in your world. We obviously in the article have touched upon the role of the sustainability or impact report, but what can we do to go further as brands in order to create that trust dynamic with stakeholders?
I think that is a really, really good initiative, Charlie, because it cuts through the polarization of the issue in many ways. We always have to remember that the loudest voices are not the majority in this argument, and that for a lot of businesses, engaging with stakeholders actually means demonstrating progression beyond making unreasonable adjustments that might put a brand or a business at in financial distress in order to meet these requirements tomorrow. I mean, the government's fallen foul of this, right? You have ambition, and that's great to have, really clear objectives and really strong ambitions. But again, it goes back to, the practicalities of delivering on such a major issue. And we also need to take those into account and provide regular communications about how we're taking continuous steps to improve rather than solve. And again, that goes back to the report and talking about the maturing of the argument, and again saying, yeah, this is more complex than we've given it credit, and we need to make reasonable adjustments moving forward. So I think, how do we present that back to brands? I think it's exactly as you've laid out in your initiative, Charlie. It is the regular communication that we are also on this journey learning. And even I'd say that some of the best brands are the ones, to Cat's point, Unilever example, where they say they've made mistakes. made mistakes and they got this bit wrong, and they've made they've made adjustments to their approach as a result. So I think again it goes back to that point of transparency and not sort of giving in to the expectation of the vocal minority on these issues. The point here is that even though the political conversation has changed, people have woken up to the complexity of the problem. The social contract, the societal contract with business hasn't. They still expect you to be pushing this agenda and being responsible as a business. So what you see within the sort of the survey figures and the trend analysis over the last 10 years is that has remained relatively consistent, if not increased. So the public expect you as a business to lean into this agenda. And yet you're seeing more businesses go quiet on it because of the legislative ramification and the polarization of the argument and not being bold, moving beyond that, beyond the arguments of the vocal minority. So I think be more transparent and be more self-deprecating, maybe to some extent. Make sure that you are continuously talking about how you are improving and learning and you're on this journey together. And then thirdly, root that in the benefit to the stakeholders that you serve, customers, employees, and shareholders, investors, absolutely. They're one group that haven't shied away, particularly in Europe, of their desire to see you run a sustainable business. So I think in many ways we're overthinking this, and actually we and we always encourage our clients to do this, is to, within what is rooted in fact and what is rooted in authentic communications, be bold about that, because there's an opportunity to differentiate yourself from a brand perspective, but you are also putting yourself at grave risk if you don't talk about this topic. And it might not come in 12 months, but it will come in 5 if you're not a business that has regularly communicated on this issue and aligned yourself with the expectation of the public to be responsible in this area.
Can I, Rob, you pitched that beautifully, and Kat, I want to come to you on this next one, but I'm going to throw this analogy at you, which I'll probably regret doing so, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. This wasn't mine, so again, I'm going to pass this on to another who I won't mention them, but if it falls flat, then it's very much on them. But the description that they used when talking about this was, it's almost like considering going to see a counsellor. Going to see a counsellor to talk about one's mental health is a very sort of, for somebody that's never done it before, it can be a very worrying thing to do. It's all about vulnerability. It's ultimately something that could possibly lead to skeletons in the closet coming out that perhaps you weren't aware of, and behaviors that you're having to face up to and address. Is there a little bit of that analogy coming through in, as Rob, you've beautifully described there, organizations that perhaps are a little resistant to presenting themselves in this slightly more vulnerable, very much more human way of saying we're a collective of people that at times have made mistakes and got things wrong, and we're going to be upfront with that and set a different course. Are we dealing with sort of the leggards, if you like, that are perhaps just not ready to engage like that, or are we seeing that begin to change?
I guess we have to ask ourselves, what are the implications of getting this right? And it's, it's behavior change, it's better decision making, it's quicker decision making, it's increased brand value, etc. What are the implications of getting it wrong? It ranges from business failure to total climate meltdown. It's pretty extreme, but you might say the same thing about counseling. What are the implications of getting it right? You could be happier, more stable, etc. The implications of getting it wrong or not doing it potentially are the status quo is the same, or things get worse. I think that's the analogy can be applied here as well.
Well, I'm pleased you liked it. I can't now take credit for it, so no, I'm going to pass that on to my colleague. But Rob, just you were going to come on and make a comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think it's also a reflective of the short-termism that the mindset that we live in today, and it is becoming more and more concentrated actually as every year passes. And I think the analogy works in exactly that way. You can probably get by not speaking to the counsellor for a year, maybe 2 years, maybe you do 5. But eventually that breakdown will come, because you haven't made the adjustments to actually deliver on your health or deliver on your health of your business long term. And so I think this is the problem that we have as communicators. Marketers find it much easier to drive into that short term mindset, because they have to deliver a behavior of intent, and that's hitting next quarter's numbers. Communicators have to justify the existence of an investment for 5 years, and I think that's where I would always. We always get into a bit of a grappling match around this, which is, it's very hard for me to tell you exactly when that long-term pain will come, but I can assure you, based on historical precedent, that it will come. And I think it's any time business diverts from its responsibilities as defined by the public, right? It is not about how you define them internally. That really, really doesn't matter. It's how you are perceived by all of your stakeholders. And if they believe that you divert too far from their expectation, the power that the consumer holds now is absolutely enormous. And I think you will start to see the businesses who have continued this era of silence really, really start to suffer at a very practical financial level in the long term. So I think it's about encouraging business to recognize the risk and the downside. This isn't about fear selling. It's about demonstrating that a business aligned with public perception and expectation always outperform those that don't. And brand is now vastly more nuanced than how good your product is at delivering on its on its outcomes. It's about doing right by the societal perspective on a whole host of issues, and I think this one is absolutely at the forefront of those expectations right now.
And Rob, that was, and again, beautifully presented. And I think what's again really encouraging is thinking about your own report and the fact that we are seeing continued engagement across the board, and we are seeing that need to perhaps be a little bit more careful in the way that we go about communicating the work that we're doing. And as you said, I think this maturing and this resilience, if you like, the terms that you guys have used around where we've got to with sustainability comms, is a great thing. And I think that for me, there might be a moment where I think somebody referred to this during a panel I was on recently, where they just talked about perhaps green hushing. We'll look back on it as a collective pause of an opportunity just to go, do you know what? How are we communicating this stuff? And as Robbie, you alluded to, maybe we are being a little bit too generic. Maybe we are being too emotive in the way that we present things. And maybe we do just need to get a bit smarter, a bit more joined up in our thinking about how we communicate these things. So, it might not be the worst thing in the world that we did just take that collective moment to think about the way that we communicate and head into a new dawn. Guys, we have had a whistle-stop tour through, I know, the article. And for obviously our listeners and viewers that want to check out the original article that we discussed, we'll provide the links, but we'll equally be, for those listeners and viewers that are interested in seeing Clarity's report, we'll obviously be linking to that as well, so you guys can check it out. I myself have had a chance to go through it and would recommend anyone interested in this area to check it out too. We're going to finish now with some magic wands. Now, Cat, I know that in our preamble, you suggested that you're actually going to physically use your wand in the show. For anybody watching this is going to be quite something. It's my first thing to happen on the Responsible Edge. But I'll come to you first, Cat. If I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be? So,
cha-ching, there you are. I'm using my magic.
We've got sound effects as well. I mean, I wasn't expecting that. Brilliant.
So does a wand go cha-ching? I don't think it does. Whoosh, maybe a whoosh.
Yes, very good.
Or a kapow. No, I would like to see a ban on pension funds being able to invest in fossil fuels. And I worked with Climate, which was a sustainable investing platform, very, very passionate about where we put our money, or how it can be a force for proper change, and came across an organization called Make My Money Matter. I don't know if you have ever heard of them. They're a movement that was led by Richard Curtis, Love Actually, Richard Curtis, film director and producer. And I went to see him speak about this exact thing, about pension investments into fossil fuels. Now, most people don't know, or certainly didn't a few years ago when I first learned about this, where their pension pot is invested, and probably don't care. Now, that might be changing now, but the corporate world is obviously very key in this, in that it employs a huge amount of people investing a huge amount of money alongside the public sector, which is actually, if in terms of pension pot size, the UK, I think it's the education university scheme, is actually the largest investor. But at the moment, there are something like £90 billion invested in fossil fuel companies through pensions. And I didn't know this, but I did when I heard Richard talking, that the impact of greening your pension is 21 times more powerful at cutting your carbon than giving up flying, going vegetarian, switching energy provider. Any small but significant move that you can make as an individual combined.
Wow.
So, there is definitely a kind of communications challenge around this, because it's being written about by people like The Guardian and very sort of socially conscious publications, but I would not say that it's mainstream yet. There was a brilliant series of social ads, I think it was end of last year, run by Make My Money Matter, which I follow, with Olivia Colman as Olivia Coalmine and Benedict Cumberbatch as Benedict Lumberjack. And they were talking about, they were kind of these evil overlords talking about coal mining and deforestation, respectively.
Love it.
Talking about how they profiteer off your pension money and to the detriment of the planet, and there was burning. It was really good and very powerful, and I think they did it for free. So yeah, I'd like to see all pension funds banned from investing in fossil fuels, because that small change could have a really significant impact, and it would be amazing if that were a movement that spread internationally. Obviously, we're talking about the UK here, 60 million people in a world of 5 billion. I know not everybody has the luxury of having a pension, but it has to start somewhere. And you asked me, Charlie, what would I like to see change as a result of working in communications in this industry? Achieving something like this would be an incredible coup.
Well, Kat, thank you for holding back and then delivering that. As you're going to get your first here of the show, because I think that's a brilliant suggestion. And I have to say, the Make My Money Matter initiative, as you've alluded to, described there, if we aren't able to cause an outright ban of pension funds investing in fossil fuels, then we can definitely shout out Make My Money Matter and perhaps get people to start influencing from the ground up, if you like, where their pension is invested. But a brilliant suggestion, Kat. Thank you for that one. Rob, over to you. Same question. What are you going to do with your magic wand? Feel free to use with various memes, etc.
I think as a result of mine being much more boring and frankly less dramatic, I think I'll avoid any swooshing just because it would be misleading for what's about to come out of my mouth. I would ban corporate language, and I'm sorry to be such a terrible communications nerd around this, but I think the main problem around a lot of these issues is the accessibility. That is driven by corporates, by policymakers, the real decision makers in a lot of this across a lot of this issue. They use language that simply blocks access for those groups that I spoke about, that sort of I'm passionate about representing. It blocks them from coming into the argument for fear of sort of not really understanding the issue or feeling stupid. And the reality is that anybody who is very, very bright doesn't need to use complex language to sell and seed fantastic ideas. And so I would absolutely ban any over complexity of the issue and how we solve it.
Rob, I again, you're going to get another here. That is a brilliant suggestion, and one that we've not had on the show before. And I think that really highlights the real impact that communications can have, because you're right. If we suddenly overnight just all the wishy-washy terminology, which I'm going to have to hold my hands up here. I am am poor myself at adopting some of this language. I think we all do, don't we? We all begin to talk to each other in language which is like, do we really need to explain it in that way? Or is there a much simpler, much more accessible way to describe it? So I'm not saying I'm perfect in any way, shape or form when it comes to this, but the impact of that, if we suddenly did all start speaking a very accessible, common language around these things, would be transformational. It would allow us to do things much more quickly, for decisions to be made with speed and with clarity. So I think that's a fantastic suggestion. I'm going to ask you both one follow-up question, though, on Rob's suggestion. What's the worst bit of corporate language, phrase, term, etc., that just really,
I've got loads, and actually, I've just finished reading a book. It's sort of a little. It would make a perfect secret Santa gift for somebody who works in communications, but because it's sort of set hypothetically in a Marcom's agency, but it's all the language that we use that we need to ditch. I think the book is called Circle Back, and it's just been published. So I'm sure your viewers and listeners can look it up, but it's great. But that term itself, circle back, is one that I hate. Just say you'll come and talk to me again at another time. The whole circle back thing bothers me. So that's why somebody gave me that book, because I hate that term. So that's it for me.
I love it. Rob, the worst offender?
The overuse of the word strategy, ironically, is probably the one that winds me up the most. I think strategy is about, bringing it to perhaps a slightly more relevant phrase. I think ESG has done more damage to this conversation than any other acronym or phrase. And I think when you look at the history of its usage, it was there to provide highly educated investors with a simple metric to drive investment decisions. How that acronym managed to become salient in this conversation to every stakeholder, I'll never really understand. But I think as an industry, it was lazy. And I think that we need to seriously recognize that is become politicized, probably rationally rather than unfairly. So I would like to see that one gone, and I'd like to see a very clear definition of what strategy is. And when somebody can do that, can they please inform me, because it's quite important for my future role.
Guys, just suggesting from Rob's perspective, we'd really like something added to the comments on YouTube here to provide some insight, and we'll feed that back to Rob. Guys, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I know that was a whistle-stop tour, but a really interesting conversation from my end, and we definitely covered some interesting ground. So thank you both for joining me this morning.
Right, thank you.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A huge thank you to my guests, Rob Agnew and Cat Biggart, for showing us how strategic storytelling isn't just a branding exercise, it's a bridge to trust, resilience, and relevance. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the independent mark of integrity for sustainability reporting. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.